Okay, Eloy Sarate, storyteller.
Xenia Lubicic, historian.
And I think I'm going to be a little bit of the historian this time too, because I've got a lot to say on this one.
All him.
Yeah, well, not all me, but hopefully we can get there. The last lecture, we talked about revolution, 3 different models of revolution. Again, if whatever country you are from, or wherever you were born, the narrative or the idea of revolution, of nation, of constitution, all becomes very important in how we politically organize our worldview. As a Latin Americanist, there are some things that are incredibly complicated because Latin America is not one place. It's 23 places or 24 places. It's not one nation. So when we talk about decolonization and revolution in Latin America, we have a multitude of areas, regions, continents. So you really can't just say it is one place.
I was just going to jump in and say that as we've said, we've had these dialogues for decades, and that as a historian of the French Revolution, as I would watch the scholarship develop, I would say things to Eloy, and he would say, "Oh, you guys are finally starting to talk about that." Because in France, we do talk about it as one place, although scholarship now is saying, "Oh, there's actually different places inside of France, and they're going to have different experiences." But a lot of the work in asking those questions had already been done in Latin America. And it's always been a really interesting conversation to have, because it does show you sort of how place is so important in the way that we understand the history.
So we have Haiti, we have the United States, and we have France, right? So the French Revolution is going to set a particular model in terms of the social and political reality. The United States, you should all understand by now, it's an incomplete revolution, because you're going to have the Civil War. Because if you look at the United States when it becomes independent, it's really 2 countries. It's a northern country and it's a southern country. It's a more commercial country in the north. It's more of a slave plantation economy in the south. Haiti brings the idea, it's a liberal revolution when it starts. We want to be free from France. But then you have a social explosion that comes when the enslaved people start to incorporate the idea of what is to be free, what is a liberal democracy. When I started looking for a dissertation topic, and I don't know if you know this, so this might be totally brand new to her, I studied Mexico. I studied and got interested into African Mexicans, Afro-Mexicans, because the great proportion of the Mexican population was African American before the independence movement. And it is, particularly in certain regions like Veracruz and Guerrero, the coastal areas where you had particular economies that allowed for African Americans, African Mexicans to be part of that economy. Now, when the revolution started in Mexico, an area called Guerrero, which is in the lower coast, I started looking through some documents. And when the independence movement starts in Mexico, the owners of slaves armed their slaves to fight for independence. And I was like, what is going on? Why would a slave owner arm their slaves to fight for the freedom of the slave owner? And what I found when I started to research is that they were arming their slaves because they understood that if they can become free of Spain, they would have a stronger control of their economy and control of their trade. They would not have to go through the crown anymore. So for them, hey, if I become more free, I can arm my slaves and they can fight for their freedom. And then when the independence movement is over and I get more power, I can be able to divvy up my land, give land to these individual slaves so they can start working on their own and start paying me for the goods that we're exporting rather than me controlling their labor. You had people who were way ahead of the game and realized that I can now organize myself in a way where everybody can benefit from the independence movement.
But isn't this sort of when we were talking about revolutions and the way that the text we're using right now puts a lot of the movements and developments all together. So the Enlightenment and that rationalization isn't being presented as it came first and then came the revolutions, that it is part and parcel of the revolution. And to me, it sounds like what you're describing in Mexico is exactly that, that the landowner is understanding the economic systems and how they need to change in order to benefit him, which is part of that bigger process of economic rationalization, of making it more efficient, that you're seeing playing out even in the French Revolution.
So what begins this movement of independence in Latin America is a reform movement. A reform movement that was influenced by the Enlightenment, become more rational, become more organized. What the colonies, and this happens in the United States too, but we don't put as much emphasis on it, is that what the Crown is beginning to do in all the European countries is to create rational policies to benefit from the increased trade, and also to be able to incorporate politically their colonies as they become to spread, as they start moving out. So the reforms that were implemented in 1850 that are called the Bourbon reforms in Latin America, they will be called differently in different areas, is that how can we increase revenue? Well, you increase revenue by freeing trade, allowing people to trade more. Now, if you're a crown, you don't want to hand that all over to your colonies. So what you start to begin to do is that, rather than just the European country becoming the core, what we'll do is create different cores. We'll create a core in Mexico, we'll create a core in Peru, we'll create a core in Argentina, we'll create a core in Venezuela. So now, rather than having to trade with the country that's across the ocean, now you can trade freely within your colonial spaces. More trade, more tax, more revenue. And it is a smashing success. The problem with that is that all the relationships that have been built during the colonial period, politically, is now going to be controlled by those central areas that used to be controlled by the crown. So if you're going to increase trade, what is the crown going to do? It's going to send more representatives, and it's going to make the colonies look like they're being invaded or controlled or strong-armed by these particular areas. So that's one reform that's going to happen.
Which I think, and maybe I'm not correct in this, but just to give an anchor in terms of ideas that students might be familiar with, this is the Adam Smith laissez-faire, governments step out, sort of the idea that trade will regulate itself. But what you're seeing is that theory being applied in a colonial structure, whereas where it's being applied in France, you don't have that colonial legacy. So it's going to have different implications in terms of how it's experienced by the people.
So you're still trying to rationalize trade.
Right.
You're still trying to make increase revenue, but you're doing it within a colonial structure. So that's going to have a political consequence. You see that clearly in the United States when you have the colonial elite now starting to say, hey, the crown is passing these laws and we don't want to follow these laws because we want to control our own trade. That's the first step, right? The second step that's going to happen, the challenges to this, is that as you start freeing up trade and you allow more opportunity for more people to participate in the economic structure, it's going to dismantle the economic structures that colonial period had developed up to that point. In particular, relationships with Native Americans, with the indigenous people. In most heavily indigenous areas, the strategy of the crown has been just let the Indians do their own thing. They already have a political structure. We'll try to work as much of their political structure into our own, but because there are so many of them and we can't control them, we're going to kind of let them do their own thing. What happens with the reforms is now you're going to tax the indigenous people directly and they have to pay through cash rather than through their goods, right? Because paying money is more rational than paying in goods. What happens with the indigenous people is now the relationships that they've been paying, their taxes have been paid by some intermediary, is now going to confront their independence. The crown's going to come directly to them and say, we need 10 pesos or 100 pesos in tax. The indigenous people will say, well, go talk to Jose over there. He's been paying our taxes for as long as I can remember. They're like, no, Jose doesn't have his job anymore. We're coming to you directly. How are Indians now going to get money? They have to get participating in the economy. From the Spanish point of view, they're civilizing the indigenous people. Now you're working, now you're able to pay your own taxes, you're not doing your own indigenous thing that you've been doing for 200 or 300 years. The indigenous people get really upset at that.
And so in terms of kind of the patterns of the class, this is where those visions that we've been using to frame our discussions, the traditional vision, the liberal vision, the democratic vision that we're working towards, this is where you sort of see the bulges in those systems, where the ideas or ideologies that are driving them don't capture everybody, work for everybody. It becomes an issue.
Now, the people who are for the crown, in the traditional sense, see this as a threat. The indigenous people who've created relationships with the particular elite, they're starting to see it as a threat. How are you going to react to this? Over time, as the reforms are being implemented, you see a stronger and stronger and stronger push against them. So in different parts of Latin America, you're going to get a different reaction. The same way we see different reactions in France, the United States, and Haiti, the same thing will happen in Latin America. Where you have areas that are more tied to the outside, more tied to the Enlightenment, they're going to see these changes as a benefit to them.
So I think for me, one of the things, and again, this is the fun part of having two historians with different specialties, because it's so diverse. And my experience in Latin America really is just more through our travel. So I think one of the things that I found really fascinating was when we traveled in Peru and we were doing our Inca Trail and we were hiking, and there was this real sense of embodying both spaces of our guides speaking Quechua and being very much tied to their indigenous traditions and heritage, but at the same time also seeing themselves as colonial products. And I think one of the things as we were talking about this lecture that was really interesting was Tupac Amaru.
Yes. So one of the most famous reactions to the reforms that happened in Latin America is the Tupac Amaru revolt. This happens in Peru. It happens in the 1770s, 1780s, right after the reforms are implemented. The traditional elite, having relationships with the traditional elite of the indigenous people, these reforms are beginning to undermine the power of those traditional elite. Jose Condorcanqui, who is a traditional representative of the indigenous people, who is also a bureaucrat of the Spanish crown, is being bypassed by these reforms. He tries to petition, he tries to tell people, do not do these reforms. I want to control the way I've always controlled things. But the crown now with new representation says, no, you're going to follow our rules. These reforms you have to follow. He gets frustrated, even though he first tries to petition and go through the process that has been laid out for a century is now being undermined. And he gets so frustrated, he calls himself a king. I'm the second coming of the Inca king. And what happens is he gets all this support from all the indigenous people around Peru. It's going to last for about a decade. Thousands of people are going to die. But you see here that force of the traditional is still there with the indigenous people. Tupac Amaru, the revolt, is going to happen as he starts going around getting support from all the indigenous people, says we have to fight for these reforms. All these indigenous people who see these problems say, you're right. Who are the problem? The crown. But not just the crown, all the white people that have been here. So what he's starting to also create is this crisis of colonialism. The traditional society is beginning to transform itself. Those traditional structures, even the traditional colonial structures that have created a harmony, are now being challenged. And like the same thing that happens in Haiti, you start unleashing the idea of freedom and liberty, and all these people come to try to end that. And there's no way to control that. So in Peru, one of the most conservative areas of independence is going to have to be liberated from the outside, right? By Argentina, who is an outpost, who has gained tremendously from the reforms because now they have free trade. They start hooking on not to the idea of transforming their society, but transforming their relationship to the crown. It is in Argentina that the majority of the white people that live there, that the majority white population will say, we want freedom and liberty. Argentina will look a lot more like Boston in terms of its relationship to the colonial period. And they will create somebody who's going to liberate. Another area that's going to be problematic is Colombia, where you have a mix of a white large port, right? Caracas, and a large indigenous mixed race population. What happens there is kind of like a terror. You have the white people beginning to try to implement reforms. They benefit tremendously from the reforms, but you have a large white liberal population that says, hey, maybe we should be free. We can't defeat the Spanish on our own, so we go to the countryside. What happens to Colombia? They go to the countryside, and then that force overwhelms them. So what happens to Colombia is going to be a mix between Argentina and Haiti and Peru, because you have both forces at the same time. They start defeating the royalty, but then once that war is over, a civil war starts between the mixed race people and the white people. And then you start going, well, we can't let that happen. And then they defeat the crown again. Then it happens again. Happens like 4 times, a civil war within 10 years, because those forces are much too strong. So you have Argentina, you have Peru, you have Colombia. Those are all different reactions that fit within what we have already with the Haitian Revolution, the United States Revolution, independence movement, and France. These are unleashing powers that cannot be controlled and will last for decades.
So as you study, he's given you a lot to think about.
A ton to think about.
But I think if I were gonna, and again, it's fun because I always learn, but I think one of the through lines for you to follow is we've talked a lot about the building of these economic systems. We've been looking very much just at what is being done globally. And here you have an example of systems that are being built and established, but when they're implemented in a different context, they're going to have different consequences. And much of what we're going to be looking at in the upcoming lectures is this process of grappling with the democratic state. Who do you include? How do you include people? How do you create a society that is truly representative? And I've always thought that the Latin American examples are fascinating because they are dealing with such diversity in their population and layered with a colonial legacy, layered with all of these other elements. So your job is to kind of trace that through line, to see if you can follow those systems, if you can think comparatively about what's been happening in these different areas, and to follow the repercussions.
And I think from here on out to the rest of the class, asking yourself, what is traditional? What is liberal? What is democratic? You should ask that in terms of political, economic, and social structures. What are those forces? Because these forces are going to become much more familiar to you as we start reflecting upon our own understanding of how things should be done. We have it in our country, red state, blue state, right? Conservative state, liberal state. These things are playing out worldwide. And usually when we look at countries, we ask, why didn't it work? Why are they having so many problems? But we're not asking what are the forces within those countries that are challenging these seemingly normal paths to freedom and liberty.
Great.
Yeah.